Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you in this event where we're going to discuss a great book by Mark Carney, Values, Building a Better World for All. I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Yonwanda, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge that it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we have a duty of stewardship toward this land, and we acknowledge the great privilege that we have to be here to discuss this great book. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the author, Mark Carney. It doesn't need much introduction from this crowd, but we're so, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Mr. Carney, from joining us from Gatineau today. Currently is the Vice Chair of Brookfield Asset Management and Head of ESG and Impact Fund Investing. We know him well because he served as the Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, and prior to that, Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. He was the chairman of the Financial Stability Board, and prior to his governorships, he worked at Goldman Sachs, as well as Canada Department of Finance. And we know that now he's currently serving as the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. So, Mr. Carney, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for being here. We'll start, so our audience knows, we'll start a little bit with a discussion about your book, you and I, and then I'll go to a panel of junior fellows because Massey is about intergenerational conversation and dialogue. And we have here Amanda Loder, who's a fifth-year PhD candidate in physical geography and environmental studies. We'll have Li-Tin Yu, who's a PhD candidate at Rotman's School of Management, and she studies how financial information is important and disclose and affect market participants, particularly examining the efficiency of ESG investing. And they're all junior fellows at Massey College. So we have Rushay Naik, who is doing a master in health policy and global health at the University of Toronto Dalla Lana School of Public Health. And finally, Evan Kotler, who's also in his second year of graduate work in biomedical engineering, where he conducts research in the field of tissue engineering, regenerative medicine. And I know that he's worked in the finance sector as well. And they volunteered to do that, and they've been putting questions together for you, Mr. Carney, so we're delighted to be. But let me start with just why the book? Why was it important to write this book at this time?
It's a very good question, and I asked myself that in the depths of the first lockdown as I was slaving away on it. Look, in part, it was because of my experience as you referenced some of my background experience as a governor, really during a period of crises. I began as the governor of the Bank of Canada at the start of what was the global financial crisis, was known as a credit crisis. My last weeks as governor of the Bank of England were the beginning of the COVID crisis, including many of the key decisions taken to try to bridge our societies across the health crisis. It's quite a long bridge now. It looks like it may be extended again. And then throughout my time as governor, we had a series of crises, the Euro crisis, as an example, issues around Brexit, and of course the climate crisis remorselessly building over the period of time. And so the question I wanted to ask myself, or pose for myself, well, was there a common root, and were there some common lessons for all of us, whether we're leaders in whatever capacity as policymakers or those in business and finance? What were the genesis, common roots of these crises, and what can we do about them? And I settled through a period of both reflection on what I had seen, some economic history, political thought, not comprehensive, I'll admit, but some of that on this relationship between value and values, and the fact that it goes in both directions, and that we need to both recognize that and harness it where possible.
So reading the book, I think, is it feels like a little bit part memoir, part exploration. We really enjoyed the review, I think, of the history. I've learned a lot about the history of the concept of evaluation and so on. And eventually we get to the crisis, the climate crisis, where you say net zero isn't a slogan, it's an imperative of climate physics. And then you present it as an opportunity for us all. Did you feel that you had done everything that you could have done as governors, as governor of two banks, or is it? We have a sense that we're a bit too late coming to the party or coming to the realization of what we should have done? Anything you would have done differently?
Well, we're certainly collectively very late. I wouldn't give up yet. I wouldn't say we're too late. I don't think you would either, Nathalie, and I'm interested what our junior fellows have to say on that subject. I suspect they have more energy and ideas than both of us combined. But it is late, and so it's a good challenge. Would I have done more? I'm going to give you an answer, maybe not entirely satisfactory, which is I probably would have done more. I'm not sure I could have done much more in the roles that I had. And let me explain that a bit. I could do a lot more about the issue as governor of the Bank of England than I could as governor of the Bank of Canada. Partly that was because I was better informed about it, partly because the world had dragged its feet for a few more years, but most fundamentally because the powers of the Bank of England are much broader than those of the Bank of Canada. There's no reason why people would know this unless you're involved in it. But for example, we oversee the insurance industry in the UK. We Bank of England. It's the fourth largest insurance industry. It reinsures against a number of extreme weather events, so it's directly relevant to their business, and so actively managing this is important. And then also, and this is the most fundamental thing, is in part because of the experience of the financial crisis, where arguably the central banks, and including the Bank of England, didn't look around the corner, didn't think about what could go wrong, didn't prepare the system for a bad event, in this case in the housing market and the financial system. The Bank of England has very broad responsibilities and powers to think about what big systemic risks are out there and what can be done to prevent them. And of course, climate is an existential risk, becomes a systemic risk, and the challenge is then, well, what should be done in the financial sector? And I'll finish on this, Nathalie, which is, of course, narrower than what needs to be done across all public policy, all actors, in order to address the issues. But it's not inconsequential, and we set ourselves the task of first identifying the tragedy of the horizon, but then taking steps to help bring the future to the present, so at least the financial sector could start to act to play its role to helping achieve greater sustainability.
And this is, now that you're the United Nations Special Envoy, how do you see your role evolving, from the book to now trying to convince a larger group of actors to be conscious and act forcefully and with commitment, as you describe?
Yeah, no, it's not because of the book, but it is consistent with the book that what we're trying to put in place, and we made a lot of progress in Glasgow. I wouldn't ever say mission accomplished on this issue, but a lot of progress, and we can go into that. What we've been looking to put in place is a financial system in which every decision takes climate into account, and that means additional information for financial institutions. It means new tools. It means new markets in some cases. And really what we're looking to do is recognize, and to the credit of people around the world, and I stress that people, social movements, young people, indigenous peoples, non-state actors, to use that, it's an ugly term to capture a variety of organizations, really have been standing up and saying, deal with this issue, to governments, to companies, to financial institutions, to people with power and influence. And that creates a circumstance where as I try to describe in the book, where there is no longer this trade-off of values of short-term and long-term, of planet and profit, but a hierarchy of values with a desire for sustainability in its broadest sense, but with respect to climate specifically, that crystallizing around a transition to net zero, consistent with 1.5 degrees. That hierarchy creates the opportunity to harness the power of markets to help be part of the solution, not the totality of the solution, but help be part of the solution. So my remit for the UN is quite broad, like all UN remits, broad remits, lofty objectives, absolutely no power beyond the ability to convene and try to convince. And so we were fortunate for COP26, the Glasgow meeting, to have a very strong meeting of minds with the COP presidency, the UK government, and working towards really transforming the financial system so that climate was a fundamental determinant of not just risk, but of value for financial institutions. And I'll finish on this and we can draw it out as much as people want, but there's really two elements to getting there. One is what I said, those information tools, the markets, the plumbing of markets, if you will, a bunch of very important, but quite arcane and technical changes that needed to be made so that markets actually work. And then critically, commitments of the financial institutions themselves, again, not to a vague, but a worthy but vague ideal of sustainability, but to real hard numbers around a transition to net zero. We've got both, and now both need to be fully implemented.
And that's going to be the next work. In the book, you have a list of a 10-point plan for government to do. Has it changed after Glasgow? I'd like to have your thoughts on where we go from there post Glasgow.
Yeah, well, so the 10-point plan in the book is broader than sustainability. It's all aspects of sustainability, if you will. Yeah. It's helping to develop human capital, abilities of individuals to prosper, not just through the climate transition, but also the digital transformation of our societies. In terms of the specifics for Glasgow, I'm sorry to jump around in the book, but the sort of 3 R's, the risk reporting, the returns, the mobilization pillars, for that meeting, that actually fell down to about 24, exactly 24 specific deliverables, again, to use an ugly term from the policy world, but specific initiatives. All of them were achieved in Glasgow. Okay. So we got a global sign up for a new reporting arrangement, sustainability reporting arrangement that Li Ting View probably knows a lot about with her work on ESG. We global sign up for stress testing for new markets, et cetera. So all of that was achieved with very strong buy-in from governments and commitments to map what had been voluntary initiatives into formal mandatory regulatory processes, and that's critical. And then alongside that, the commitments from the private financial system, commitments that still need to be followed through, of course, but commitments totaling around 40% of global financial assets, with the intent to align themselves with net zero. And that is above the scale of what's needed for the climate transition. So that hasn't changed. What's changed is now the full implementation of all of that. And of course, when one works through a strategy, you see additional things that are necessary to be added. And the core of the strategy is being implemented, yes.
Okay. So let's go to our junior fellow here. And why don't I start with you, Li Ting, since we just talked about reporting. So your question to Mr. Carney.
So So Mark, in your book, you remark about how the cost of, for example, destroying a rainforest to biodiversity, to climate, it doesn't appear on any corporate ledger or any ledger for that matter. And now there are entities and regulators who are working towards creating frameworks to account for and disclose about these negative externalities. Arguably, that's a step in the right direction, away from not acknowledging that whatsoever. But since we are trying to move away from a market society and really underlay our capital markets with a foundation based on societal values, do you foresee us moving from this first step of quantifying our values, assigning values to our values, towards actually truly prioritizing values in a sense? And for a general audience, if so, what are the steps that you foresee in that process?
Okay, that's a fantastically framed question. And someone who's been asked a lot of questions over time. Normally there's ways to wiggle out of questions, but let me go to the the richness of the question because it's very important. I'm gonna do one characterization of the problem, one of the problems you're identifying, which is that if we could assign a dollar value to not just the cost of carbon related to climate change, but to the value of the services provided by pollinators, bees, for, to agriculture, and the value of even an imputed or implied value to the bequest value of the species themselves, the beauty of nature, our responsibility to that. There's various ways to try to make those estimates through surveys, revealed preference, other aspects. But we would end up with a system where inevitably we're weighing off those values with a dollar figure against financial values with prices determined in the market, and they're mixed together. The first set of values based on well-meaning efforts, but a series of assumptions, including on discount rates and the actual value of nature, as I say, the bequest value of nature, mixing them with hard numbers that come from the market. And you get this danger of what I would call one true number, what appears to be one true number, and an optimization around that, which it would be quite remarkable if that led to the right answer. Okay. I haven't added anything to what you've said. I've just said another way of stating the problem or the challenge. The way I think about the framework for addressing broader biodiversity and to be nature positive while we're transitioning to net zero is to recognize a few things and have a few approaches. And I wouldn't say this is totally comprehensive, but let me give it a shot. The first is that stabilizing the climate, achieving net zero is a necessary condition for to enhance biodiversity, or at least to arrest the decline in biodiversity in nature. A necessary but not sufficient condition. So there is value in the broadest sense in the transition to net zero. The second is that there are some markets for net zero, or that will promote the achievement of net zero, that themselves can capture some of the value of nature and biodiversity. And I'm thinking specifically about the efforts that are underway to develop broader markets for nature-based solutions. Again, nature-based solutions for climate, carbon offset, and other markets that have co-benefits through those activities. So think reforestation with biodiversity as opposed to just monoculture reforestation as an example.
We're having trouble hearing you. Maybe if you can just, Mr. Carney, if you could just be a bit closer to the mic. We're having trouble hearing you at times.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm getting a tiny bit of feedback as well, actually, but I'll do my best to speak up and alert me if it's still problematic. So we have offset markets that can provide co-benefits as another step. The third step, as I suspect you know from your research, is to actually meet nature on its own terms. And one of the examples of that, potentially, it depends on how it comes out, is the task force for TNFD, natural nature-based financial disclosure. And I tend towards the view that ultimately to measure biodiversity, to measure nature, is on its own terms. In other words, species preserved, populations increase, populations of those species increase, reforestation, acres, on biodiversity metrics, again, on the terms of nature as opposed to the terms of value. Of dollar value, if I could put it that way, so that there's not a mixing ultimately of the enhancement of broader sustainability, broader nature, broader biodiversity, and the financial metrics in the market. Last point, if I may, which is that one of the climate has proven to be a very, very difficult thing to address. It's obvious, or we wouldn't be in this mess. As we start to address it, one of the advantages is that it's measurable. There are hard numbers around it. Your emissions are either going up, they're leveling off, or they're going down. And if they're going down, you can make judgments about whether they're going down rapidly or consistently with what's required for 1.5 degrees. You can make estimations, and you can have a market in carbon that can result in the right prices for those. The market itself, financial markets, other participants can make judgments about the value related to that. Climate is much, my point being, it's much easier, even though it's very hard, to address and to fit a framework for than it is for the question you asked, which is about broader sustainability in nature. So I hope you caught some of that.
Yeah.
And if you didn't catch any of it, the really interesting bits were unintelligible.
That's right.
So,
Evan, is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for that answer. That was great. In your book, you highlighted obviously the tragedy of the horizons, which we've just discussed, as well as the tragedy of the commons, as two almost generator functions for a lot of the risk that we see in the landscape of economics, pandemic risk, climate risk. I wonder, when we look back at generations previous, going back to, for instance, indigenous societies and their capacity to maintain stewardship over lands that span multi-generations with far reduced coordinative capacity compared to what we have today in terms of the technology that we have access to. What seems to underpin a lot of the tragedy of the commons is that lack of coordinative capacity, the lack of trust and lack of capacity to ensure that those rivalrous, multipolar game theoretic interactions that you have aren't going to be exploited by those other actors that are also tapping into that shared resource. And so I wonder, is there anything that we can be doing better now outside of regulation and private ownership that ensures stewardship of shared resources, of those commons? And can we learn anything from those previous indigenous societies that managed large swaths of land with many, many numerous people occupying it? They seem to have skirted around these tragedies that we now find ourselves within. And so a bit of a two-pronged question there.
Yeah. Well, it's another great set of observations and question, Evan. The one of the things, and since you picked up on game theory, I don't know if you're a game theorist, but the difference between a sub-game perfect equilibrium and a finite game and an infinite game, right? So if I know that, for those who aren't game theorists, and God forbid, it'd be amazing if everyone on this, webinar is not a game theorist, but just in case somebody's not, it's one of the basic insights of game theory is that if it's a finite game, and you and I are playing the game, and either of us get a bigger payoff if we defect as opposed to cooperate. Once we know that we'll defect at the end, we defected the first plane of the game because it cascades back to the an infinite regress, or not infinite, but just regresses back to the first plane of the game, and we defected the start, even though if we cooperated, we would have had a period of time where we had a better payoff. I'm not sure I explained that perfectly well, but you get the point. Whereas if it's if it's infinite game, we cooperate. And it goes to a broader point, which is whether one sees oneself as part of a system and as part of a continuum, whether one sees a responsibility and a legacy, and whether as part of all of that, we're viewed as a part of nature, not apart from nature or separate from nature. And implicitly, what we have developed as a society is a sense of nature being separate, and that we can draw upon nature as opposed to us being integral to it. Now, unfortunately, there's many challenges with that. One of the things is that we've been reminded, tragically with COVID, that we are very much part of nature. We can't separate ourselves. We can limit the relationship, but we're affected by the evolution of nature and of the virus, and it's very much the case with climate, certainly for billions of people, rising numbers of people, and all of us affected in some way, even if we can take preventative or mitigating measures because of wealth or other aspects. So it's that attitude and that recognition. So this where I'm headed, Evan, is kind of, I think, to the heart of hopefully to the heart of your question, which is part of this is attitudinal, and whether we view ourselves as part of a system, a part of nature, having a legacy and a responsibility that spans our current generations and our the generations after the generation after us. Which is a characteristic of many indigenous societies and many traditional societies, if I can say that as well. In the there's but is not a characteristic of necessarily financial modeling with net present values and those aspects. And so this is where I find cause for hope is that I think that the in a context of having left things very late, is that the strength of view and feeling an importance of reestablishing the importance of nature and sustainability and appropriating onto our generation. I'm going to mix me in with your generation, Evan. It's quite horrible for you. Your generation, my generation, responsibility for dealing with these issues. Again, once that's established, then you can help create value by solving this existential risk. Natalie, I can see you're getting anxious because I'm taking too long. The climate crisis is not going to.
Yeah, we want to hear from you. It's
Okay.
Great. And why don't I just ask Amanda if she wants to?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to stay on the climate crisis topic and ask a broader question, sort of coming back to when Natalie asked you about when you were governor of the bank, was there more you feel you could have done to address the climate crisis? Given the climate crisis we've known and recognized for decades, arguably, why do you think it's taken so long to begin leveraging such large funds from institutions to address this wicked issue? And based on your experience, what do you think we can draw from lessons learned, whether it be from the 2008 financial crisis, even COVID, to begin getting to where we need to be on the climate crisis and meet our targets by 2030?
Yeah. Well, again, it's a good challenge, Amanda. I think the first thing to recognize, I mean, from one perspective, is just what a poor job governments have done with this issue. And this will sound like a bit of a cop-out, but for a long period of time, I think a number of people who recognized the issue felt like, quote, they were going to do something about it. They being, someone else is going to address it. Governments are going to address it. And, we think of here in Canada, we heard over time and time again, it's not like we've been without climate strategies. We've been, I was going to say blessed with, I think probably cursed with, woefully inadequate climate strategies for decades, either because they weren't ambitious enough or they weren't practical in any way, shape, or form. Now, while those strategies are being developed, it's natural doesn't mean it's right, but it's natural for those who are in enabling industries. Finance, in the end, finance enables activity. In other words, or it can prevent activity as well, but it enables activity. I mean, I can't, if I'm a bank, I can't make you buy a house. I can give you a mortgage if you decide to buy a house. If you want to set up a company or a not-for-profit and you need to borrow for that, I respond to that request. I don't, get you to start the company itself. And so there can be a tendency for finance to respond as opposed to lead. The core issue, why didn't governments do enough? Why didn't the financial sector look forward far enough into the future? Why weren't companies doing enough? Why weren't people protesting enough? To my way of thinking, it's the tragedy of the horizon. I mean, people, by the time they wake up to it, it could be too late. That has not happened. Things have moved much quicker in the last few years than I would have dared hope when I first raised the issue 5 to 6 years ago now. And one of the core things we did for finance has been to bring the future to the present and ask the institutions to think about whether they're on the right path. And that's what a climate stress test does. It says, well, if you continue to lend to the companies in the industries you do today, what's that going to look like in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years if Canada's on a trajectory for 1.5 degrees? And by the way, what will it look like if the world's on a trajectory to 3.5 degrees? So the latter is physical risk, the former is so-called transition risk. And now that you've looked in that mirror, what are you going to do about it? What's your strategy for that? How are you going to help companies adjust today and for it to be part of the system? So that's that's the dynamic as I've experienced it. Could we have pushed more in the financial sector in the absence of broader public support or more serious government policy? I'll answer it this way, which is that the conversation over the course of the last 2 years in countries has been, your country has a net zero plan, and then you go to companies and financial institutions, what's your plan? I mean, you have two options, basically, or three options. One is, I'm going to develop a net zero plan consistent with 1.5 degrees because that's the legislation in the UK and Canada, for example. The second option is, actually, I can't, because I can't see a pathway to 1.5 degrees. So I'm going to run my business off over the course of the next 10 or 15 years, redeploy the capital and the people maybe. And the third option is, well, I don't, I'm separate from society. I don't care what now that's not a viable option. It's not an attractive option. And in a more purpose-driven economy and society, I would say it's not sustainable. But when we started that conversation at the start of 2020, so less than 2 years ago, only 30% of global emissions were covered by some form of net zero commitments at the country level. And if you rolled that back in Canada 5 years, 10 years, we didn't have a net zero commitment. We had a sort of slightly hand-wavy objective towards sustainability. So it makes it's quite the sort of remorseless logic of the transition exists now when after Glasgow we have 90% of global emissions covered by net zero commitments. But it didn't exist before. And last point, part of the reason why countries have moved in the last 2 years has been, people have not just moved, but they have been much more, to their credit, vocal and effective in their demands that this be addressed. And so that's how this more virtuous circle has been created. And now we're in a position, I said that was last point, Natalie. Now we're in a position where the commitments at the core of the financial sector, GFANs, are stronger than the commitments of countries, or they're more consistent, they're more coherent with the transition that people say they want.
Thank you. Actually, and Rushay, your last question, and then we'll go to the audience with your questions. And I know several have some good questions to ask. Rushay.
Great, thanks very much, Natalie. Hi, Mark. I wanted to turn for a moment back to COP26 because I think it is an important case for what you're talking about and some of this sort of agitation and the work of activists. I think it also gets us to think about how that happens in the here and the now. And so, in your role, obviously, as UN Special Envoy on climate and finance, you made some big headlines. There was that historic $130 trillion commitment of private capital towards adaptation financing and towards a transition of economies. But at the same conference in Glasgow, we also saw some major issues emerge. Some described it largely as chaotic of an experience. We often saw activists who were left out of rooms, unable to enter the conference itself because of long lines to entry, a lot of logistical challenges, as well as some aspirational platitudes around net zero commitments. A lot of talk around what offsetting really looks like and whether we're actually committed to real cuts in emissions. And so when we take all of that into account, having brought the world to Glasgow, to one place, if we couldn't bridge that spatial distance between those who were at the negotiating table and those who were attempting to speak on those issues in Glasgow, what gives you confidence that we will be able to bridge that cognitive distance between decision makers and those who are most affected by the crisis, who are quite far away often from these tables? What do you think will sustain an ongoing dialogue of values in those conversations?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in that. One, I'm not sure I'd necessarily take logistical challenges of having 25,000 people of the official delegates, and how you logistically have them. Logistics weren't fun. I was part of, I was a recipient of the logistics, not a beneficiary of logistics. During COVID, where everyone has to be tested, everyone, as far as we can tell, it was not a COVID event, which is remarkable given, the breadth of people brought in from around the world at a difficult time and in close proximity for 2 weeks. So yes, there's logistical challenges would come with that, but there's also logistical challenges with having 25,000 people in one place. Look, you can't negotiate things with 25,000 people. I wasn't in the room where the negotiations happened either, to be absolutely clear. The intergovernmental negotiations are intergovernmental negotiations. I mean, we processes to select our governments. They're not all great in all countries. They're not perfect in any of them, but we have elected representatives. We had, for Canada, we had the Prime Minister, the Minister of Environment, the Deputy Prime Minister, I'm going to offend the Minister of Natural Resources. We had lots of, of our elected officials and their support were there and in the rooms that they were supposed to be in for. And then there was lots of outreach and engagement. But in the end, when you're striking agreements between countries, which is what one element of COP is, you have the representatives of the countries and there's a whole process that is judged in terms of the development of those positions of the countries, and those governments have to be held to account in terms of whether they've adequately represented the variety of interests in their own countries when they come home. And in terms of the commitments, you know, let's be absolutely clear about the sort of noise signal, or the noise to substance around offsets is deafening. It's a favorite subject. It's tiny. The offset market is tiny. There's $130 trillion committed to mitigation. The offset market is $1 billion per annum. Like, it's not, it's not a basis points of that. It's and the commitments are around absolute emission reduction, not offsets, to be clear. And some like to conflate those, and some like to, some haven't done the work to understand the difference between the two. But there's a huge difference between the two. And, that market, if it does develop, the offset market, which now has, as a consequence of those imperfect intergovernmental agreements, but necessary intergovernmental agreements, to accomplish something called Article 6, which completed the Paris Agreement, which after all is an intergovernmental agreement. It's not an agreement between 8 billion people on the world. That creates the possibility of an offset market across governments and from companies, and it creates the possibility of a flow of money, not certainty, from the richest countries and the most powerful corporations in the world, and most financially endowed companies in the world, to indigenous peoples, to the poorest parts of the world, to develop nature-based solutions. Now, that may not happen. And those companies and countries are separately and first and foremost on the hook for absolute emission reduction. So there was a lot in your question, but it sort of mixed a number of different processes and concepts and elements. And look, I'll say the last thing about as per the richness of the discussion thus far, and I know we have more to do, there's a broad range of issues around sustainability, around nature, around just transitions, around everything. There is a narrower set of issues around stabilizing the climate at 1.5 degrees. An absolutely enormous set of issues around that. And getting those elements in place, if we don't lock those elements in place, we can talk all we want and do things on the edges on the others, but it's just going to get overwhelmed by the march through 2.5, 3.5 degrees. And the story, there are many things accomplished in the run-up to Glasgow, and much more needs to be done. But I think what is significant is that the centrality of the net zero transition has been established over the course of the last couple of years in a way that it hasn't been there previously. And the architecture, the plumbing of that is in place. The finance is there if countries and companies want it, is the way I would frame it. And so the question is more to countries and companies, well, do you really want it? Are you really going to make the steps that are necessary to achieve it?
In a way, and maybe I can invite some questions from the audience. Ian, you had a question first. I'll have Ian, and then I'll go to Christine. Ian. Okay.
Me? Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Ian.
You can. Okay. My son is doing a graduate degree at the Columbia University Climate School. So I thought I would ask him if he has a question. I have to fire up my phone again. The introduction is, you've talked a lot about private and public capital solutions to some of these large problems that we are confronted with regarding climate change. Question, how can we make innovative solutions originate in Canada rather than passively investing in solutions that others have created? Are we just going to be a big pool of capital, or can we be a leader in coming up with solutions on our own?
That's a great question. Well, I think part of where one gets innovation is through, necessity is the mother of innovation. So what are the biggest challenges we have in Canada from a climate perspective? Also, what are some of the advantages we have, and so what can we and where can that innovation come from? And I think we do see elements of that, and some promising aspects of it. A lot has to do with the nature of our own energy transition and the energy resources we're blessed with, and they are very broad, those energy resources, and they include enormous resources of hydro, the perspective of expertise in hydrogen, both blue and green hydrogen, different views on those, but opportunities there, the opportunities in nuclear, including small modular, the opportunities, indeed the necessity in many respects for a period of time of scaled carbon capture. Those are engineering technological solutions that would naturally come or could naturally come from Canada, as opposed to us waiting for them to arrive from elsewhere. And I think there's a reason, from what I see, a fair bit of evidence of that. There are also non-standard, or what might appear as non-standard, solutions coming out of Canada. And actually, since this is Massey College, and you're a couple of steps away from the Creative Destruction Lab, if my geography is correct, one of the deep areas of expertise is in Canada is artificial intelligence, and a variety of applications there, including building optimization. We need to optimize given the swings in temperature in Canada. HVAC optimization is one of the best returns in the course of this decade, and there's some leading Canadian companies, Brainbox being an example. I have no relationship with them, to be clear, that have that type of expertise all the way up. And this is stretching it a bit, but there have been some recent developments on fusion, which depends on real-time adjustment of magnetic fields. Again, the only way to properly do that is through machine learning, very advanced machine learning techniques, as I understand it, which is an expertise in Canada. So I don't know if that quite does your son's question justice, but I think where we are seeing are I wouldn't say early stages, but advanced early stages of some of these technological solutions generated in Canada that would then have broader applications for it. I think the other area, maybe, and I'll finish on this, which came up earlier in the questions, is there is a fundamental, and in fact it came up straight from Nathalie's introduction with the invocation, and our as yet very much unfinished business of reconciliation and stewardship, and providing in a non-market way, but in a supportive way, stewardship of the land and nature-based solutions. And when I say solutions, I mean solutions to enhancing nature, and again, to repeat, providing proper stewardship, which is an opportunity through the nature of the Canadian dialogue, Canadian governance. When I say Canadians, I mean all Canadians, First Nations, that could be a model. We're not there by any stretch, but could be a model from a governance perspective for much broader applications.
Fascinating. So I had Christine, and I think I had Graham as well. Christine? Oh, there's a question. There's a question from Diane Sachs, who's online here. Diane says, the IPCC shows that even if all nations reach net zero by 2050, the climate will worsen for approximately 20 years. How can political economic leaders sustain public support for the transition through this, especially in Canada? considering the power of the provinces and the resistance of some provincial governments. Thoughts, Mr. Carney?
I think Diane's point is a critical one, which is even if we, and as she would know, even if we could magically flip a green switch right now and at the 1.1 degrees the world is at, the climate will get worse. This is just the climate physics from the warming and the stock of greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. And that will be ever more the case at 1.5 degrees. I think so how do you maintain, first is to recognize that. I really welcome the question and underscoring this is we need to understand just the scale of the challenges we already have. Secondly is to reinforce the understanding. One of the things that may be underappreciated, I'll just make this point if I may, which is that what happened in Glasgow is that for the first time with the countries, their agreement is that 1.5 degrees is the objective of the IPCC process or the UNFCCC process. Because it was less than 2 degrees at Paris with a stretch of 1.5, but it wasn't really 1.5. It became talked about in those terms. And the reason that it has, in my view, is that it was tightened in Glasgow, is that the science tells us that it's that much worse going from 1.5 to 2 degrees in terms of the actual effects. It's nonlinear. And so even though it's much tougher to achieve, it's that much more important to do so. It's recognized as that much more important to do so. So understanding what's at stake and translating the abstract of 1.5 degrees into the tangible of what it means for hundreds of millions of people who will be in uninhabitable jurisdictions, what it will mean for coastal flooding, what it will mean for certain livelihoods and impacts and recognizable species loss and nature loss, I think is important. The interprovincial element, the one experience I had, if I had one takeaway from my time in government, is that virtually everything is interprovincial. It's technically not on the Constitution, but certainly has that dimension. And any most major decisions are interprovincial and requires that form of negotiation, compromise, but recognition that we're all serving, or those levels of government are serving Canadians, and that that's the same citizen as a citizen of Edmonton, of Alberta, of Canada, and he, she, or they are affected by these core decisions, and so the shared understanding of the physical impacts is part of the way you build that consensus.
Christine, one question.
Speak through my mask.
Yes.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Mark. My question is asking, can you elaborate on how your thoughts about the cryptocurrency and NFT space have developed since the writing of your book? As both digital subcultures and nation states have already or consider adopting it into their everyday lives, what would you caution to policymakers and citizens about blockchain currency and its effects on these issues you've raised of sustainability, risk, and valuation?
Okay. That broadens the topic set considerably, but look, I think the first thing is that let me just talk about quickly about the evolution of money in the financial system. I do think that there are some valuable innovations around decentralized finance, the broadening of ownership that is made possible by NFTs, for example. The tokenization of certain transactions can bring efficiencies and opportunities. I'm of the view, though, that it doesn't make sense and is not ultimately won't ultimately be sustained to have a series of exchange rates within an economy. So you're sitting there in Toronto, and if you went to the Madison around the corner and you had to pay in Canadian dollars there, but if you went to the Maple Leafs and you had to pay in euros to watch the Maple Leafs, and you went out after the game and had to pay in yen at the local Japanese restaurant. I mean, that doesn't make sense, or at least it introduces a series of frictions. You'd have to be tracking exchange rates on a daily basis within your life in Toronto. It doesn't make that much more sense to blend a fluctuation of a cryptocurrency with its application in a decentralized financial world. The value of the activity, whether it's in the metaverse or whether it's for trade finance or some other aspect of that, is in the activity, and the token and the link of the token into the financial system can be performed on the basis of either a stable coin, which is a separate issue, or a central bank digital currency. So ultimately, I think where the system will end up is there is innovation. We'll have a series of tokens, potentially including tokenization of carbon, but the actual currency value of it will be centered around a fiat currency that is digitized. Certainly, and one of the aspects, this isn't, it's not even necessary for this, but it's an obvious point, which is that it doesn't make sense to set up a whole new, highly carbon intensive system for the financial system. We have more, and the argument that is sometimes made that this will help pull forward innovation in renewables and others is just ignoring the fact that actually, because of what we've been talking about today, requires at least a $1.5, if not $2 trillion a year additional investment in renewable energy for over the course of every year for the next 25 years, and that's more than enough demand pull to improve the efficiencies of those technologies.
Let me just see. I have how soon until central bank digital currency go global, which would provide. Well, I think we just talked about this. Let's hear from Sir Graham here.
Thank you. I wondered if I might ask whether, in your work advising governments on climate adaptation, you have any reflections on the self-harm of Brexit, when a government willfully ignored the warnings that you and other experts were giving them about what would actually happen if they went ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll bring it back to what we talked about at the start, which is that one of the responsibilities of the Bank of England was to look at situations and say, okay, what could go wrong here, and what can we do today to prepare for those risks, so that if they materialize, the financial system at least is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so in the case of Brexit, what we did, and our warnings around it, or interpreted as warnings around it, were to outline, without a deal, and with an immediate overnight exit without a deal from the European Union, what could be the impact on the economy, and what does the financial sector would need to have done in order to be ready for that. In this regard, when we put in place those protections in advance of what turned out to be a modest arrangement that was struck between the UK and the EU, and is still, in some respects, being negotiated or being adjusted. Turns out the consequence of that was that the system was pretty robust about the shock of COVID and the impact of that arrangement. So, look, it's a slight dodge of your question, but what I would say is that, for authorities, particularly financial authorities, part of your job is to is to plan for the shock and put in place the shock absorbers. And that's what we've been trying to do for climate. What's flipped around in climate is the world's moving, even as the risks go up, the world's moving towards solutions. And as it moves towards solutions, then the financial sector is shifting. It still has to manage those risks, but is shifting to looking to really provide money, capital to companies and countries that have the right ideas to get emissions down.
A chance, Mr. Carney, it's so important to have an economist speak about climate change. I think it's what we have wanted to hear for a long time, to have that voice clear and well articulated. Anything that you want our audience to know as what should they do and what are your next steps?
Well, I think a couple of things on a forward agenda. One is that on an individual basis, I think in all of our choices or most of our major choices, whether it's what we eat, what clothes we buy, the vehicles we drive, where we live, and in finance, whoever deals with our RSP or our savings. I know it's hard to say that in front of students who have neither RSPs or savings, but someday that will happen. What are those companies doing about the climate? To what extent are they providing part of the solution? It's very hard for everyone to be pure green, but are they tracking their impact? Are they trying to get better, and how quickly are they? And then you can make informed choices like that. I think separately, from a Canadian perspective, it's come out in a number of the questions and comments, whether it's federal, provincial, whether it's First Nations, Indigenous peoples, very much part of the solution, companies, financial sector. This is something that touches all aspects of our lives and the economy. We all obviously have an interest in it. We all need, if there's ever a time for the Canadian values of working together and developing shared solution and then implementing the solution. The one thing I will just stress on this, maybe a final point, is in the end, we need to get emissions down rapidly. And so it's developing those solutions, but then it's being very, very diligent about actually implementing them and seeing the progress. And, we can do it without, I'm very confident we can do it, but we have to really get on with it.
Well, and we have to get on, unfortunately. It's true. I want to thank you. I want to thank the panel of Junior Fellows and the audience for being here. But I really want to thank you for accepting our invitation. And you're always welcome to Massey, and I hope that we'll have you here again. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks very much. Thank you.